Good morning, everyone. My name is John McFarland from Teacher Education here at Stan State. I have the pleasure of introducing our next speaker. Welcome to our second and final day of the Social Justice Conference here in the Central Valley. For those of you who are back at home, live streaming, enjoying your breakfast, maybe a cup of coffee, and joining us in, that's great. We look forward to having you here. So we are going to be here for this morning. We will be coming back for more sessions in the afternoon. But to get us started off today, I will be introducing Lindsey Bird. And Lindsey recently left a 17-year teaching career, the past decade, of which spent as the developer, instructor, and coordinator of the Language Institute, a specialized program serving immigrant, refugee, and asylum-seeking high school students in Modesto, California, which was nationally recognized as a model for supporting the needs of newcomer students. Lindsey is a social justice champion and ally to immigrant students and families at the local, state, and national levels. She is an alma mater of the Teach Plus California Fellowship, and Lindsey advocated the state legislature for tenure reform, as well as successfully inserting explicit protections for newcomer students in the education code. She received Maestra del Año award by the Association of Mexican American Educators and the Amiga of the Year award from El Concilio, and was honored as a Carlston Family Foundation Outstanding Teacher of America. Lindsey is currently an independent consultant, part-time faculty, and student teacher supervisor for the CSU Stanislaus Single Subject Credential Program, of which I'm a part, and a leader of Teacher Plus California's Emergent Bilingual Change Agent Network. In this role, Lindsey coaches and supports 27 K-12 teachers from across California in collaborative and sustained teacher-led professional development around teacher leadership and equity, with a focus on the needs of emergent bilingual students. Lindsey earned a BA in Social Science from California State University Chico and a Master's in Education and Literacy and Digital Learning from the University of San Diego. Please check out Lindsey's TED Talk on the superpower of empathy. I believe that would be on YouTube. Yes. So please welcome Lindsey Bird.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you all for your interest in this topic. And nothing like waking up on a Saturday morning to social justice. My people, I'm with my people. So what I'd like to start with is one of my favorite quotes. I have many, but to me, never forget that justice is what love looks like in public, speaks to the disconnect between sometimes the values that we profess to stand for, the policies and laws we vote for, the words that come out of our mouth, and then the reality for too many of those in our community, specifically those who are the most vulnerable. So what I will be sharing with you is my love language, my experience as an educator and as a teacher and as a lifelong resident of the Central Valley. There will be definitely time for questions at the end. That being said, if there's anything that strikes you as I speak, please don't be shy to raise your hand, because I'm open to both formats. I'm going to start at the end and then move backwards, because this is something important to share with you. The poem at the base of the Statue of Liberty is called The New Colossus. And because of that, when the newcomer program that Dr. McFarland mentioned that I helped develop and coordinate and teach in, that was highly successful, when we saw the writing on the wall that it was being systematically dismantled, we did a charter petition. And so through that charter experience, we decided we were going to name our school New Colossus Academy because of the quote that you see here. And the ongoing struggle for us to have those words as, the guiding motto and emblem of our country. and what it truly means. And because of our commitment to doing just this, seeing education as the backbone of a citizen who can be self-reliant, contributing members of the community, and what happens when we intentionally deny people that opportunity, our school was going to do both. Our traditional mission, which was, educational equity for immigrant, refugee, and asylum-seeking students, but also welcome students who had been marginalized and traditionally disenfranchised for generations, which meant anyone in the community who didn't see themselves as being valued in the school system could join us. The charter was not successful, but that doesn't mean that the mission isn't still here. So that's what I'm here to talk about, is reflections on how equitable education should be the number one priority for meaningful access for all students in the United States, even though their pathway might look different. So this is my former classroom. And I want to share this with you not only as a visual illustration of the diversity that was in my classroom in good old Modesto, right? Like, who would have thought that Modesto, California was truly a mirror of world politics when you think about it? If you look at the regions my former students were coming from, over 42 nations over the course of the decade. 20 plus native languages brought through the doors. So this was a routine that we did. If you have ever taught high school, or if you ever plan to teach high school, I'm gonna give you a little advice. Don't dive into content the first week, because the master schedule is gonna be a mess. Kids are gonna be moving in and out. So community building activities are a great way to fill that gap. So I would do that, and have the students come up, put a pin in their country, introduce themselves to the class, the things that we would probably think are really simple, right? Would take a while, because these students were entering sometimes not only not knowing English, but many not even knowing the Roman alphabet, having not gone to school for years, sometimes ever. So this was a very rigorous activity for the students, and a great way for them to visually see that they were not alone, even if they couldn't understand the words that were being said. That being said, I want to tell you about an opportunity I had to reflect on some ways in which I was othering students, which I had not realized. So, naming the fact that high school master schedules are a disaster often the first week of school, my class of U.S. history that was supposed to be specific for just the newcomer students had some mainstream students that were there, which I thought wonderful. I love the fact that our newcomer program was a school within a school, because I think it was mutually beneficial. My newcomer students got to play soccer. I mean, one time a Language Institute young man was the homecoming king. How American is that? But on the flip side, the students that lived in the neighborhood were introduced to students and cultures from around the world. So I think that their education was richer having our program on campus. I was going through this activity, and like I said, I had about 5 mainstream English-only students that were temporarily in my class until they fixed the master schedule. And I asked them to participate in this activity like I did the other students. And, the whole idea of a nation of immigrants, right? Everyone that's in the United States is an immigrant, is what we've all been told, right? So I asked a young man who was there, African-American boy, to do his introduction. And he said, I can't do it. I don't know where my family's from. And, my immigrant students that had been told this is a nation of immigrants had these looks on their faces. And I said, do you mind explaining why? So he did. And it was in that moment that I realized, man, this nation of immigrants is such a romantic idea, right? Like, we look back, we tell ourselves that we're a nation of immigrants, that everybody came here because they wanted a better life, right? It's very much about opportunity. And through this young man being willing to tell his story, his origin, it opened up a wonderful conversation. students, first of all, did not know the experience of African Americans in our country, because one young lady who was there that day told me like 3 years later, when she had the English and the comfort level and the perspective to communicate, she said, I was so thankful that he told me that, because I only knew about the Black experience in the United States through YouTube. And so I thought that being Black in the United States made you cool and a celebrity, and that they were richer than everybody. And she just had a totally different perception of the Black experience than what this young man shared. And so from that moment on, she started looking at her peers with wider eyes. I had students say, well, now that he said that, I mean, I'm technically Mexican, but my family didn't cross the border crossed them. What does that mean? And then I had students say, well, I'm from Central America. We say America, right? It's all one continent of indigenous blood. And, so I am technically American, even though you claim America as your country. We were having the most in-depth intellectual conversation that I had not anticipated having. And it helped me reflect on the myths that we tell, right? Like that as a history teacher, me saying the nation of immigrants, I was unintentionally othering so many students and their lived experience. That being said, access to quality education is something that had, if you think about those students who this nation of immigrants myth has othered, Native American, indigenous peoples, people who were living in Mexico and the border crossed them, the African American experience, have they had equitable education access over the generations? I think that the data tells us that they have not. And so it was really this full circle moment for me to realize, A, I needed to be reflective of what I had internalized and what I was unintentionally passing on to my students, and B, how interconnected these new students from all over the world were to the histories and the past of other students that were on our campus. That data would suggest we could do a much better job serving. So what I hope to do today is give you a little bit of an idea of who I am, so that you can have the frame of reference of what it's like to be an advocate in the Central Valley. A story about, the Language Institute, the ups, the downs, the lessons learned, the need that still exists in our community, in our region. And then last, what can you do about it? So that's the point, right? As I assume that anyone who'd wake up on a Saturday and be here in person or log in online isn't doing it for entertainment, right? You want to be able to have information on how do I get involved. And so hopefully there'll be some meaningful ways that if you're so moved, you can make a difference. So, what brings me here? First, I would like to name that I am born and raised in Modesto. Like many of my peers, maybe you can relate, said, once I go to college, I am never coming back. It's my ticket out, and here I am. It was actually perfect blend of my passions to be an education advocate, because I was like, do I want to be a lawyer? Do I want to be some kind of a political activist? And then when I found myself here as a social science teacher, serving students learning English as a second language, I was like, oh wow, I can do both. I can be a teacher, which I always wanted to be, and I can be an advocate. And to be honest with you, I don't think I would be as effective at what I did had I come from another place, because I felt like I had a peek under the hood about the things we don't talk about, right? The part of the culture that you can't really name, right? That you can't, what is it about this place? I still maybe can't put my finger on it or name it, but I experienced it, I witnessed it, I lived it, and so having that perspective, I think, really, really helped. If I had $1 for every time I was accused of being from the Bay Area. Did you guys know it's bad to be from the Bay Area? I didn't know this. I don't think it is. Every time I was asked, I wore it as a badge of honor. But I can't tell you how many times I was asked that question, and people were literally shocked when I said, no, I'm from here. Went to Sonoma, La Loma, Downey High, 1995, baby. Like, I'm a local girl. Just because I don't, think the way the status quo does, or maybe fall into the norms, doesn't mean that I'm not from here. And so, as a student in Modesto, having the joy of being at an elementary school where during that time we had the GATE program at our school, they would bus students in to where our classes were. My class was more diverse than the neighborhood I lived in. I think I learned as much from sharing space and educational opportunities with diverse students of different ethnic backgrounds, different linguistic backgrounds, but probably more importantly, different socioeconomic backgrounds. I learned so much in that. And then it was interesting because the diversity that I saw in that elementary class, I witnessed as I went up, to junior high, eventually high school, that we weren't in the same classes anymore. Back in the mid-90s, when I was in high school in our area, we still had what is called tracking, where we had, this is crazy, but literally there was a class called Basic U.S. History, then there was College Prep, then there was AP, right? Well, guess what you saw when you went into the basic classes, right? It was primarily students of color. Now, these are reflections that I had once I became a teacher, right? Looking back, it wasn't like I was really truly aware of that at the time. But, as an adult looking back, once I became an educator, I saw that, the students that were put into those basic classes were equally capable. In fact, some of them have gone on to do amazing, wonderful things. It just was twice as hard or took them twice as long. And so the reason I mention that is because I reflected on those things that I saw and that I experienced and I was a part of, it helped me kind of grasp the changes that needed to be made in the system for my students. It's really also important to realize that I think, when we look at data, we look at numbers, I call it an opportunity gap. I don't call it an achievement gap. And I say that not just because I learned it in a class and read it in a book, but like I didn't live it. I am the first in my family from the Central Valley to graduate from college, which my grandpa had 13 brothers and sisters. So there's a lot of cousins out there. I would go to family reunions and be like, hey, I have English class with you, because the family was so large. So for me to be the first to go to college, there was something in the system that pushed me into this path that so many others didn't. They weren't identified as worthy of that. So I benefited from the very things that I eventually tried to fight against. Not that I don't think that students who are like me deserve that opportunity to be labeled as college potential. I just think every student should, not just certain students. So from my experience as a student here, and then my desire to be an advocate, once I was assigned the English learner sections my first year teaching, and I had grade level content, U.S. history. I don't know if you guys remember your history books from high school or maybe in college. That's some pretty dense text, right? It's not an easy read. So I had, in one class, students who were born in the United States, had no idea that they still had the label English learner in the computer, surely had no idea how to get that label off, what I know in teacher lingo reclassify as English proficient, right? Didn't identify themselves, they happened to be Spanish speakers, didn't identify themselves as native Spanish speakers, because they could speak, but they didn't know how to read or write. So they literally had no clue why they were in this class. But then in the same class, I had a student who had just arrived, who needed the very basic English in order to ask to borrow a pencil. And I was supposed to teach him all U.S. history in an equitable fashion. So from day one, I knew that there was something in the system that needed to change. I bit my tongue for 2 years to get my protection, and then I used my tenure as a shield to try to advocate for a more just system. And from that, I was thrilled when I was invited by my school district to look at the data on English learners at the high school level, and how can we serve them better. And I'm a big fan of both quantitative and qualitative data. So not only the numbers, but like the humans behind the numbers, right? So we started to talk to teachers and ask what was their perception of why English learners were slipping through the cracks in high school, not having equitable outcomes with graduation rates, A through G eligibility, all of that. And they said, well, they don't speak English. What am I supposed to do with them? Well, the data actually says 83% of the English learners in your class have been in the US school system for 5 or more years. The majority have been here since kindergarten and are native born. So their perception of their ability, because of that EL label, was hindering them serving the students to their potential. So right away we knew, okay, rigor, equity, access. That's what the long-term English learners need. But for those who truly are brand new to the country, they deserve an on-ramp. They deserve what they need to be successful in the US school system, which is a night and day different from what the long-term English learners need. So for that, in Modesto City Schools at that time, it was 83% long-term English learner and about 17% who were newcomers. So from that, the Language Institute was born, which I'm going to give you a brief history of today. This is one of my favorite pictures because I think, if I remember, there's like something like 8 different countries represented. Graduation was always a very, very special time because I think every family takes graduation really serious, but oh man, when you get to see these immigrant, refugee, and asylum-seeking families with their kids, it's a party. The custodians are like shutting the lights off, like, get out of here, people, because we can't stop celebrating and taking pictures. This picture represents the diversity that we had not anticipated. When the Language Institute was developed in 2009, at that time, the vast majority of our English learners in the Central Valley were Spanish speakers. Literally the stars aligned, because when we opened our doors in 2009 and my colleague and I were like looking at our rosters, before school, we instantly were like, these names don't all sound like they're from Spanish-speaking countries. And at that very moment in time, we started to resettle refugees from Iraq. Modesto is one of the largest refugee resettlement hubs in California. Actually, because of Turlock, we were receiving a lot of Assyrian, Iraqi refugees, because the refugee resettlement process often asks for what they call a U.S. tie. It makes sense, right? Someone who speaks the language, who can maybe offer a couch to sleep on in an emergency, maybe introduce you to someone for a job. So because of the well-established Assyrian community in Turlock and the greater Central Valley, the refugees from Iraq were in our classroom. Again, we had not anticipated this. We did not have training on the trauma that comes with being a war refugee. We had not anticipated teaching students the Roman alphabet, or the fact that students might not have been to school for a while. So it was, this is going to sound crazy, but it was a blessing in disguise, because if you think back, 2009, 2010, that was like right when the recession happened, and just, the bottom dropped out of the budget in California. So we were like grappling with realizing who our students were, and okay, great, we have this newcomer program, but we don't have the curriculum or the resources that they need. But we couldn't ask for anything because there was no money to ask for. And I say that in hindsight that is a blessing, because if we would have asked for things in that school year, we would have asked for the wrong things, because we hadn't learned from our students what they needed yet. And that took a while. That took years of us meeting families, going to their homes, finding connections in the community for wraparound services, to where we could get to a place where we're like, okay, we know what our students need and how we're going to serve them. And it was from that eventually we started to get recognized. And I say eventually because, like I said, the first school year was 2009, 2010. I would say it was like not until about 2013, 2014 when we really started hitting the ground running. Some of the just high-level things that we did was we realized the diversity in the newcomer student demographic. And students might have like their US school entry date in common, but that doesn't mean that they're a monolith. We had students that we use the acronym SAFE, so sufficient, ample, formal education. They sometimes, honestly, would have higher levels of math and science than their American peers, and all they needed was just to plug into that amazing knowledge they had and learn English, and they would soar. Sometimes they only needed us for a semester. We had students who had very high ability in their native language, but were at the very basics of English that we could simultaneously put in AP Calculus and ELD Tier 1, which for us was the beginning. Again, the beauty of being a school within a school. But we also had to build pathways for students who had gaps in their formal education. If you've heard of the, students with limited and interrupted formal education, was the reality for a lot of our students. So how could we design a program that met the needs of the diverse students? And that was, we had to think outside the box. We kind of had to blow the high school factory system up and rethink it with the needs of our students in mind. And what that looked like for us was rethinking like age and grade level. Just because, you're 15, do you have to be a sophomore? Or do you have to do world history and biology? Or if you're 15, could you be a freshman? Or if you are a sophomore, could you still take other courses that don't align with the traditional sophomore schedule? Why not? Who says we can't, right? And so we did. We would assess our students every quarter so that when they showed us they were ready to move to the next level, we didn't have to wait until the semester or the next school year. And the reason that we did that is what we believed students deserved was acceleration. So a word often used in school in general, but particularly in high school, is remediation, right? They need remediation, they're not at grade level. Well, it's not really fair to have a deficit mindset against a student who physically wasn't in the country to learn the content. So it's show me who you are and let me help you get where you want to be, right? It's an acceleration mindset instead of a remediation deficit mindset. So that's what we did. That's how we were able to use the curriculum that we had to literally quantify students starting at what we would in the US school system say preschool, right? Learning the alphabet is preschool, up to college ready in just a few years. And it was really blowing people's minds. They couldn't wrap their head around the fact that these students were excelling in comparison to their native-born peers or their long-term English learner peers at sometimes higher rates. We like to coin the phrase they were defying their demographics, right? So what we hoped, we really had two things that we hoped as teacher advocates. Number one, a lot of these things that I'm describing to you, what we did, were never put into policy. So for us, we were like, okay, it's working. We have data showing it works in graduation rates, in A through G eligibility, in lower dropout rates, and we have human stories that were shared in videos around the world. In fact, the young lady over there in the bottom right corner was in a video that was used for the UN refugee, making sure countries felt comfortable resettling refugees, because our students were just such examples of the beauty and the benefit that communities have when they open their doors to immigrants and to refugees. So we wanted those policies immortalized. We wanted them written down to where all students entering the school system at the secondary level could have the equity and access that these students were getting. And what we also wanted was to challenge the system to say, well, if it's working for these students, why aren't we doing a version of it for other demographics that data tells us we could do better by, right? It's really sad, but I was told a lot, Lindsey, it's really not fair that you're asking for things for these students that real Americans don't have. Why would we give them an advantage? Okay, well, first of all, there's no advantage to arriving in a country not knowing the language or the alphabet as a teenager. There's no advantage whatsoever. Second of all, can I have a picture of a real American? I'd really love to know exactly who it is you're talking about. And it's like, if we're able to prove that this is working with these students, why, instead of trying to take it away from them, aren't you asking, what are you doing so I can use that with other students? That was what we hoped would happen, and unfortunately, that wasn't the case. The program received 2 state recognitions. Students received national awards. They were featured on Nightline with David Muir. It was truly a program that schools around the country, and especially in California, were looking to as a model for how to serve this demographic of students, so students entering the United States as high school. So we kind of like naively thought, okay, we're getting a lot of recognition and attention. They would never touch it. But education is politics, right? And so all these little conversations that we'd heard, the things that people had said to me, you can imagine when I would show up in meetings as a white woman, people would say things to me they would never say to my colleagues of color. They would show me who they really were, and they would assume because I looked like them that I agreed with them, and that wasn't the case. These are the whisperings that were happening for years, like from my childhood growing up here, from the first few years of my teaching career, and then our national politics shifted, right? And then all of a sudden it became okay to say those things that used to be only said behind closed doors to me. People were saying it out loud on television. So at that very time of us advocating for policies to be immortalized and for the program to live indefinitely and maybe serve as a model for how to empower demographics even outside of the newcomer population, we realized that the program was being dismantled in front of our eyes, and that not only were the things we were asking for being denied, we were headed in the opposite direction. So some of the lessons that I learned is, and I shared this with you earlier, that systems create data, right? Like everything we see, all the numbers we see are by design. And what's ironic is, in my experience, I was fortunate enough to have been on the committee which planned the Language Institute. So I know for a fact that we were born from analyzing data that says we weren't serving students, right? Like that was the whole point in us creating this pathway. Yet, anytime we would make an ask that was outside of the tradition of past practice, no, we can't do that. Well, if we don't change, then the data will never change. So we are fully capable of serving every student. It is, do we have the political will, and are they a priority? And in our case, the answer was no. So the program was stripped to the bare minimum legal requirement, which is just the English language development course. And ironically, we had a pathway, like I said, where we would analyze data and everything was individualized, right? Enrollment assessments quarterly for acceleration. It was truly a pathway of empowerment. And what happened was it was so outside the box that people could not wrap their head around it. Like these students defined demographics, instead of being celebrated, it became, well, they need to stop doing that because it's putting a spotlight on what we're not doing for other students. So for example, the A through G university eligibility rate was something that I thought that the school leaders would celebrate, but what happened was they ended up, that was the first thing that was stripped away, was that little policy piece that we needed for opportunity and access, because sometimes students needed a little extra time. We had this crazy idea that when a student arrived, it didn't matter who they were, what level they were. If they said they wanted to go to college, we were like, yes you can, and we're gonna help you get there. And what would happen is, imagine, like everyone, that's here today, everybody that's watching, you all have your funds of knowledge, right? Some of it's through formal education, some of it's through lived experience. I mean, just truly ask yourself, what would you need if you were in a country that was speaking and reading and writing in a different language? Maybe, let's say, a different alphabet to make it even more challenging. Like, where would you need, with everything you have to offer, to be able to express what is already in you, yet alone learn new content, right? And that was something that was challenging, because the irony was we were actually told, one of the justifications for dismantling us was the word equity and equality was used as a weapon against us, because we were told that it's not equitable to put a student in a class where they're learning the alphabet and being taught how to write. They deserve opportunity for grade level content. We agree. We would like to build the foundation so that when they get there, they have a chance for meaningful access. We want to accelerate them to that, but that's not where you start. You don't learn a language by osmosis, right? So the pendulum has literally swung back to what they were offering prior to the Language Institute being formed. So we absolutely have the ability to change the data. It's just that we have to have the will. Excuse me. And then last, mindset truly is everything. We have to look at every single student, and I'm hoping that as I'm telling the story that's specific to newcomers, that you're seeing that the themes are really beyond just the newcomer demographic, right? Like, we have to not just say every student is capable of greatness, but we have to act on it. We have to create ways in which equity sees people's worth, their potential, their capability, everything. And that is from the classroom and how a teacher interacts with students and their pedagogy, to the office where the students enroll, to the policies, which are under what we call local control. So I'm going to fast forward to a little bit of my call to action now. I'll be more targeted and specific later, but that's a good thing and a bad thing, right? We have, in our cities, in our districts, in our community, our county, our region, we have the freedom to design educational systems, and the state cannot tell us what to do. It's called local control. It's a great thing, right? But it's also a bad thing, because how do you get voices at the table who need to be heard? Like, one of the things I think in hindsight that maybe made people angry or maybe resentful toward us was we gave our students a voice. We wanted them to be part of the process. We would encourage them to have meetings with, site administrators, and then we taught them the chain of command. If you don't get what you like here, then this is who you go to next. And when that didn't work, we would empower them to go to board meetings and use public comment. And they were articulate and fabulous and fierce. And so guess what we were accused of? Well, you obviously wrote scripts for them and told them what to say, right? Like, if that's not deficit mindset, I don't know what is. We did not. We would always tell the students, some of the things that we ask for are so atypical. They go so much against the grain of status quo past practice that you can't just say, this is what I need. You have to tell your story. You have to be proud of who you are, what you've overcome, and you have to tell your story, because that's the why behind the ask, right? And if they hear that, then I thought it would become undeniable. Unfortunately, it was deniable, but I would argue that we didn't make a mistake by empowering the students to tell their story, by teaching them how to engage in the political system, which was uncomfortable for some of them, because I remember one time we had a group of mothers who were refugees from a country where you don't speak out in public. Well, you can, but you'll probably pay a price. In fact, they happened to be from Iraq, and it was right after, if you guys remember, I can't remember what the speech topic was, but George Bush was in Iraq giving a speech, and someone threw a shoe at his head, and they were like, yeah, that's what happens when you speak in our country. We're not gonna speak. Well, we had one mother who spoke English very well, so we said, here's an idea. Would you feel comfortable if she spoke for you as a group, and they just lined up, they formed a U shape around the microphone and stood there in unity? Again, they felt great using their voice. They felt empowered. They understood the system. They were pleasantly surprised when no one threw a shoe at their head. They were thanked for their voice and for their participation, all the lip service that we pay. But in the end, it didn't matter. They still weren't effective. I don't regret empowering students and parents to use their voice, because I know those are skills that will carry on for generations, literally. I hope that my former students are the parents speaking at board meetings in the future. But in the meantime, as I reflect on it, it was the mindset of those sitting at the podium receiving it that was the problem. So that's, I think, what we can do is help people think differently about remediation versus acceleration, the difference between empathy and sympathy, right? My students don't need anybody to feel sorry for them. I mean, don't get me wrong, if you sit down and you hear their stories, they can be pretty tear-jerking, but it's like, okay, well, let's build your new future together. You never forget who you were, where you came from, but isn't the best thing you can give a student is the education that they need to be self-sufficient, to make the change that they want to see in the world. And so that's why empathy was really important for us, because we needed to know who they were in order to give them those tools, right? And the only way you can do that is by making an attempt to put yourself in their shoes. I remember reflecting at the end of the day, the first year, when I was teaching, in hindsight, God, I didn't know what I was doing. And I would see those blank stares, and, I would just sit there at my desk and say, okay, you're in Japan. You don't speak Japanese. You don't know the alphabet. What would you need in order to engage in the lesson? And trying to go through that reflective process every single day, which was an act of me trying to put myself in their shoes. Was it perfect? It was not. But I didn't feel sorry for my students. I wanted them to have what they needed to be successful. So there is a quote that is common in the business world. You might have heard of it before, that culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? You get a new CEO, you got your strategic plan. Well, guess what? If your employees don't respect you or they don't respect each other, it doesn't matter how much you pay your CEO or what your plan is, it's not gonna work, right? Well, in public education, it's culture eats policy for breakfast, because we have in Sacramento beautiful words on paper that give us the opportunity, again, at the local level, to meet the needs of diverse students, yet for some reason, we choose not to. We choose not to, right? With our votes, with our lack of involvement. So, for example, I'm going to preview something I'm going to hit on later, which is a thing called the California English Learner Roadmap. It became policy in 2017. It is a thing of beauty. I highly encourage you to get online and to look at its 4 principles and its elements. It's absolutely divine. And if you were to take out the demographic English learner, the words that it has on paper would apply to any demographic that needs equity, access, and empowerment. It really is, it starts with culture first, right? Because culture matters. If we had a silver bullet and we could teach teachers a teaching strategy, or we could buy curriculum that would work for students, we would have done that already. So much money has been put into curriculum purchases, professional developments. So why doesn't it stick? Why doesn't it work? The mindset and the culture of the individuals and collectively. So that's why it's really important that we get involved in our school system, not only for our own children, but on behalf of the children of others. The parent who can't go to the board meetings because they work at night or don't speak the language, or even the parents who maybe could go, but they themselves were not seen, valued, and embraced by the school system, so they have no faith in it. So we expect them to engage in the very system that oppressed them and speak up on behalf of their children. They can and they should, and sometimes when they do, they're angry, and rightfully so, but we need to use our voice for the children of others as well. So one thing that I want to name that I experienced is a culture of divide, that sometimes students, because we pull data on demographics, that people think that there's this limited number of resources and that we have to battle with one another. I would say that everything that we did on behalf of our students, even though you have the English learner demographic, which is very large, right? And then you have newcomers. What newcomers need when they enter the U.S. school system at first grade is going to be drastically different than when they're in high school, right? So looking at the individuals and their need doesn't and shouldn't divide us. It shouldn't be us versus them. It is something that should unite us, because we should have a vested interest in their academic success, even if, like, I'd always try to think, okay, obviously I'm in this because it's my passion and it's my heart's work, but I would try to really, again, use empathy both with my students and then the stakeholders that I was trying to lobby, right? Like, if they don't see the value in my students like I do, if they don't see them as part of the American dream, what is it that could maybe hook them into becoming an advocate? And quite often it was interesting because the very people who would not want to support my students were also the people, when they were just kind of, thinking out loud, riffing on their politics, didn't like people that lived off the system, right? They didn't want people to be on welfare and to need public benefits. And they didn't see like the intersection with how they were treating students in the system with the outcomes, and it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. There's an idea that there's like systemic scarcity, right? Like that there's scraps at the table, and if we give to those students, we have to take away from others. And that's just not the case, because, for example, if you look at the English learner demographic, yeah, they get extra money. They do. The state does, because there are things that they need above and beyond what their native English-speaking peers have. But at the same time, if we do our job right, they're sitting next to that English-speaking peer just, a semester or a year later. So it's really important that we make sure that we don't pit demographics that have been traditionally marginalized against one another. In fact, at the end of the day, we united with the very demographics that they tried to pit us against. I can't even remember what I was in the principal's office talking about, because I was always in there for something. I think that when they saw me coming, that they would shut the door and pretend they were busy. But I got in one day, and I remember whatever my ask was, the principal at the time says, Lindsay, we would love to do that for your students, but if we do it for them, then they're going to want it too. And I knew exactly who they were talking about. But I said, who are you talking about? They're always mad about something. They're going to want it too. Never could get that administrator to articulate who they was. I knew exactly who it was, because the district had just been sued for disproportionate discipline and suspension data by advocacy group who gave voice to the needs of Latino and Black boys. So I knew who they was, but I wanted to hear those words. Never got it. But it made me think, oh my goodness, this is crazy. Like, my students are being denied something they need because the system doesn't want to give it to other students who could also need it. And I was like, light bulb moment. Which is why when we built our charter school, we recruited a colleague of ours who happened to be president of the California Black Student Union. And we were like, hey, you know what? The details that we ask for to help our, respective demographics might be different, but the culture who keeps them from reaching their full potential is the same. We are partners in this, and we want to work together. So as many opportunities, I think, as we have in the system as we fight for educational equity, to identify when we're being pitted against one another and to unite is something that I really encourage everyone to do, but I think we have a real opening and opportunity to do that here in the Central Valley. As Dr. McFarland mentioned, we were not just using student voice at the local level, but this is then Assembly member, now State Senator Ana Caballero, who was gracious enough to allow us to bring our students up. And because of her, we have the word newcomer in California Ed Code, the only state in the nation that has some protections specifically for newcomers. I saw holes in it, but there's people in Sacramento much smarter than I that said, we can't write laws that are prescriptive, because you can't force one community, you can't mandate something for one community that maybe is only for a few students that would break their bank. And when they explained it, it made perfect sense, but I knew nonetheless there's policy and then there's interpretation, right? Because we talked about local control and the reality that policy gets eaten up by that culture. It allowed students who are entering the country as high school students to have the local elective credits removed from graduation requirements if they wanted to graduate faster, if they came and they didn't have transcripts or they were a later grade as an option. And it also allowed for an additional year they call it a 5th year, but I don't like that because it insinuates that the students were actually in high school for 5 years. Most of the students who needed that extra time didn't arrive until like their sophomore, junior, or senior year, so we referred to it as a super senior year. Unfortunately, the law only allowed it for A through G eligibility. We argued they should get that for literacy, and that even if they weren't eligible to go directly to a 4-year university, if they were going to the junior college or they were going to a trade school, they deserve to have the literacy and numeracy to be successful. The law is being interpreted in the Central Valley in a way that is encouraging students to graduate sooner than later. The opportunity to be university eligible is often not articulated to them, and it's like, here's less credits, push them out. It's better than nothing because they are getting a diploma, but it begs to ask the question, is the motivation the graduation statistics or the best interests of the students in the community? So there's that. And then there's also the fact that, back to my childhood as a student of the mid-90s, we cannot deny our recent history of Prop 227. And that it was the law of the land, that English be the only language taught in schools, and students should only have access to, English learner courses for up to 12 months. Unfortunately, even though we got the word newcomer in Ed Code with this law, there is no state definition of who a newcomer is. We had advocated for years the federal Title III definition, which says a student aged 3 through 21 in the United States school system 3 years or less. We receive money from Title III, so we think we should abide by that definition, but because it's not in Ed Code, it's not law. So our definition was 3 years. Unfortunately, the program, when it was dismantled, is using that Prop 227 lens, and they're saying the students only get 1 year of ELD, the bare legal minimum, and after 12 months, they must go mainstream regardless of their data. So the young lady that I had to lean over and help her sign her name when she enrolled because she was a Hazara girl in Afghanistan, which meant she was discriminated against and persecuted for who she was in her country, who then got pushed to Pakistan, never was able to go to school, had literally, I think when we signed her name on the enrollment papers, I think that was the first time she'd held a pencil in her hand. So if she entered the school system now, would be given 1 year access and mainstream classes. There's no differentiation between those students. I said, because there are newcomers, absolutely, that enter with rock solid formal education and could be successful after 12 months. Don't get me wrong, that's not what I'm saying, that they aren't out there. But that, again, not all newcomers are the same. So, again, I learned in hindsight, sometimes giving voice and empowering students, parents, demographics who have traditionally been silent isn't as popular. We like to say, get involved. We want parent participation. We don't know what to do if we don't hear from you. Well, they heard from us. And the lesson that we learned is it wasn't anything that they wanted to receive. So I really encourage everyone, for all students, but particularly, the students that I'm passionate about, these newcomers that enter at the secondary level, to use our voice and our vote in order to make sure that local control that we all are part of sees them and hears them and understands that just because they aren't speaking up for themselves doesn't mean that we shouldn't. These are a few examples of the successes we had. Yes, I'd like you to see that podium where that young man is getting his diploma. It does say Stanford. And he's a CSU Stanislaus grad. That was his master's degree. And it makes me so proud to say that he's a teacher now. And so I think that we're going to slowly change this valley over time, because that, I think, in hindsight too, another moment I had was educating and empowering these students was a threat to the system, right? They're going to come back and be professionals and parents and voters, and they're going to change it, but I would love it if we don't wait for them to do the heavy lift on their behalf, that we lock arms and shoulder to shoulder, maybe even get the ball rolling before they're back into the community. So what you can do, specifically, I told you I was going to give you a call to action, is there's something called the Local Control Accountability Plan, the LCAP. School districts get extra money for 3 demographics: students learning English as a second language, foster youth, and socioeconomically disadvantaged. They can't double dip, so if an English learner happens to also be a foster youth, they don't get double money. But it's a significant amount of money, almost double the amount as someone who isn't in one of those categories. So with that, there's a process of community input, which should be published and posted, and ample opportunity for people to get engaged. It looks different in every district, hence the word local, but it's a great opportunity for people to have their voice heard and how priorities are made. And I think priorities are evident in budgets and how money is spent. I also encourage you to get online and to look at the English Learner Roadmap, because it truly is a thing of beauty. But like was mentioned in my introduction, I'm currently leading a team of good troublemakers throughout the state, the Emergent Bilingual Change Agent Network. And the very first thing I have them do is to poll their colleagues. And that includes teachers and administrators on their awareness of the English Learner Roadmap, which just turned 5 in July. It's been policy since 2017, and 80% of educators don't know it exists. So we need to not only read it, but use that language and make sure that we're citing it when we advocate, to hold people accountable for the words that exist on paper in Sacramento, that at this moment in time aren't really doing our students good. Because if the teachers and the administrators don't even know about it, they're certainly not bringing those words to life. So if, as community members, we can infuse that in our advocacy, it would be really helpful. And then last is narrative, like seeing these students and knowing their potential, and speaking up not only at meetings and formal capacity, but the conversations that you have at the grocery store, or with maybe I'm about to go to a soccer tournament. I'm always chit-chatting with parents on the sidelines. I can't tell you how many times stereotypes about immigrants and refugees have come up in casual conversation, and rather than arguing with them about my opinion, I'll tell them a story about one of my students, because when they hear it from that human point of view, rather than I know more than you, then they tend to listen more. It's not always perfect, but I would encourage you to have that bag of tricks, the narrative, and if you don't have any, then, oh gosh, I have videos of my students. You can use their stories because they are just so inspirational, but that, I think, is how we can redirect people's opinions that are made on stereotypes. So again, the English Learner Roadmap, only 20% of educators even know it exists. Very fewer than that know what it says, and it was such a tremendous accomplishment in 2017. A lot of the advocates, in fact, there's a board member at that time who I've since become friends with. She said they were crying tears of joy when that document was passed. She, like myself, was a student in the mid-90s who was motivated to get involved by the racist propositions that came our way and wanted to make a change. And then there she was on the Board of Education passing this document, just a few decades later. But again, it's not making the difference, because we need community awareness. We need to hold our local officials accountable for that. We need to make sure that when money comes in for English learners, that our local leaders know that all English learners don't have the same needs. In fact, the words literally state in the EL roadmap that districts have to identify diverse EL profiles and should shy away from the one-size-fits-all approach. So to me, that would have justified the Language Institute, right? Like naming that what those newcomers need is different than their long-term English learner peers, I think was justified. Now, mind you, all of this dismantling happened in 2020, so the EL roadmap was law then, it was just ignored. So making sure that we're giving voice to the diversity and the beauty within the English learner population and within the newcomer population is really important. And then the reality that EdSource recently did a study that only 54 cents for every dollar that's put into the school system on behalf of English learner students is actually being spent on them. There are many people in Sacramento advocating for transparency and accountability, and we're not moving the needle. And, I could only guess as to what the reasons are, but most of them have to do about the adults, not the students. I'll tell you that. And so what we need to do is, again, at the local level, ask repeatedly, how is that money being spent? Because priorities are illustrated through dollars. And if it's not being spent on the students it's intended, then that gives us the opportunity to make suggestions and voice on behalf of these students. So again, almost half. I should also mention, once that money enters the school district for an English learner or the other two demographics, it must be spent according to their LCAP plan on that intended demographic for that school year. But if they hold on to the money, then the money can roll into the general fund the following year. So I don't know, because I can't see charts with how the money is being spent, but my gut is that some of the students who deserve equity empowerment and justice are the cash cows fueling our districts. So we need to start asking questions, and we need not just words, but we need data, we need facts. I'm a chart person. I would really like it color-coded in a chart, but if we don't ask, they're never gonna produce it. I would love to thank you all for your time and attention, and for hearing my story as an educator and the story and the journey of the students, and hopefully you got some nuggets of information that you can use in your conversations or in your local advocacy in your districts, or maybe in your personal or professional capacity. It was my pleasure to join you guys this morning. I would absolutely love to answer any questions if you happen to have the questions. This is my email. You are welcome to email me if a question pops up later, or if you don't feel comfortable asking it in front of the entire group. And if you know of an educator who, like me and my colleagues, is willing to use the protections that our beautiful union gives us as a shield of good trouble, I would love for you to get on the Teach Plus website and let them know that we'll be recruiting teachers for the 3rd cohort of emergent bilingual change agents in the spring. And our funders have a specific interest in the Central Valley. They know that the data tells us as a state that we have disparities here that don't exist in our coastal friends and neighbors. So that being said, we want as many teachers from the Central Valley as possible. So your referrals and recommendations would be greatly appreciated.
Lindsey, thank you. Can you hear me?
I can.
Thank you very much for all that great information and sharing your experiences and the experiences of your students. So working with current middle school and high school teachers who are coming into the profession and seeing already as they're going through a teacher preparation program, we are setting them up for exactly what you're talking about. Setting them up for success and awareness of the disparities that are going on currently in the system already. However, we are finding that they are somehow being, not everywhere, but somehow being blocked by veteran teachers who are working with them as cooperating teachers, and because they don't buy into this system or into this new, what we would say, quote unquote, progressive thought. What would you say to those new educators coming into this profession now, and how would you perhaps provide any kind of advice on navigating?
Excellent question. I've lived what you just described. When I came into the social science department at my school in 2003, it was old school history, right? Like the teacher would lecture, there was overhead projectors back then, I think I just dated myself. And the teachers, the mindset was they are gonna need to be able to take notes by verbal lecture if they go to college, so I am not gonna dumb it down for them. I interpreted that as, oh, you don't want to grow and reflect as an educator. So I come in out of the credential program doing the strategies that I was taught and literally was made fun of and encouraged not to do it, shamed. And there for a while I questioned, like, do I just join them in the past practice? But I think at the end of the day, I didn't come into the profession like to make friends or, I did it for my students, right? It was my social justice motivation that made me realize, you know what, I got thick skin. Like, I don't care if they make fun of me. And ironically, eventually they were trained to do it that way. You should have seen the overhead projector crew when we became a digital school. Ooh, I was like, ooh, and they're coming to me asking for help. Oh, haven't we come full circle? But I would encourage teachers, students that are getting their credential, that are in the pipeline, that are contemplating the profession, to stay centered in what's best for students. Because as faculty in a high school, it's almost like you're in high school again, right? Like there's like the cool thing to do. I also was encouraged, not to work after hours and do all the things in the community, because if you do that, they're going to expect us to do it too. That's part of the job, right? Is being comfortable in knowing what is best for your students, doing right by them, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it might not be popular, because they're going to remember you for that, right? Like, students, when we talk to them about their memories in school, they're never like, oh my gosh, so-and-so is my favorite teacher because she helped me with fractions. It's always about how you made them feel, right? And what students in your program are being taught is how to give meaningful access, right? How to see students for who they are, how to scaffold in a way to where students build that self-efficacy through success. If their veteran colleagues don't have that capacity yet, I don't think that they should water down their greatness on behalf of their students to fit in the staff room. And hopefully they will have the experience that I did. Maybe 5-10 years later, those same teachers have either retired or are coming to them for guidance, because it just truly is the right thing to do. And new teachers can be leaders in that regard, right? When students are wanting to be in a teacher's class, hanging out in your class at lunch, other teachers notice that. They might not admit it, but you can set a tone by example without necessarily having to get into arguments with the veteran teachers. It is a reality that you're going to teachers leaving the credential program are going to be taught one thing and potentially experience another when they're on campus. But they need to be aware of that and be confident that they're doing the right thing for their students, even if it's not winning them a popularity contest.
Thank you so much. My name is Goshu, and this is really a very useful information for me as someone who just newly joined Stan State. And I have worked with migrant and refugee population in Australia, and a lot of the challenges that I remember I saw was just outside of, they're very complex, and I was wondering, how did you manage working with other stakeholders in addressing some of the challenges, in addition to trying to excuse me, in addition to trying to overcome the challenges in the classroom? They are basically trying to settle, and this is on top of multiple challenges that they're experiencing. And so, be it just from simple things like driving, or understanding the culture, the system, and everything. So how did you manage working together with other stakeholders in trying to overcome, these external challenges on top of?
Excellent question,
everything?
Because you're absolutely right. I mean, when you think about the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, students need to be safe and secure before they can learn. And so you have to have external stakeholders and community partners in order to build that environment where they can eventually learn and look toward the future. You know, we again learned that lesson the hard way when we would do a beginning of the year goal setting opportunity. Well, the reality is when you've been in survival mode, you're not thinking about 5 years down the road. You don't know what you want to do when you grow up. You want to know where you get your next meal. So in terms of like the tangible things, community partnerships were great. We had, you know, the benefit of working with a refugee community is they came with a refugee package, so they had a lot of resources at their fingertips. So we had, you know, the opportunity to connect with their caseworker and work as a team, plugging them into what that meant. The biggest challenge and great need in the Central Valley is the undocumented students or the asylum seekers that are here have just as great of needs, but they don't have that community to plug into, right? They don't have a caseworker. They don't have the government benefits that come with being what we call an official refugee. So we had to build networks, and there are amazing people doing wonderful work in our community on behalf of those demographics of students, but we still have a lot of work to do here in the Central Valley. In fact, I'm excited on November 15th. We're having a gathering of all different nonprofits that do legal work and LGBTQ protections for immigrants, asylum-seeking, you know, casework. We're all coming together in Fresno to just like look each other in the eye and be like, okay, first of all, we need to know who's doing what, because sometimes, you know, that was the biggest challenge, is identifying the resources that currently exist. Because so too often, you know, you have a need and there's an agency that can serve it, but you just don't know about it. And then identifying gaps in that net, and what that looks like for different communities, right? Because it's not, again, just like the EL roadmap says, there's no one size fits all for instruction and education. There also is not one size fits all for the wraparound services that the students need in order to be safe, secure, and given an ability to learn. And I would extend that to their families, because you can't just advocate for the student, you have to advocate for the whole family. So it's the identification and the plugging in of wraparound services for the entire family unit. And one of the benefits, too, of having a lot of immigrant, refugee, and asylum-seeking families in our area is plugging them into that community. Like, even if we don't have answers, like having people that you can get together with who have a similar background, share culture, language. We really encouraged that, is building communities within communities for the support that I can't provide because I don't have that shared lived experience.
More questions? Thank you, Lindsey.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
We do have orange juice and coffee outside if you want to grab some real quick. But we'll start with Amer. We'll give him a chance to get set up. And
oh, good. Yeah, I'm happy to come back to the area, so if needed.
adapter, do you have a built-in HDMI?
I need an adapter, yeah. The USB-C's right here.
My original idea was
Yeah, I was just in case, I thought. But is there power here? There's power everywhere, yeah. Oh, okay. Just in case. I don't want to die. That's good. Yeah.
All right, we're going to move now into our featured presentation this morning, which is brought to us by Amer Ahmed, who gave a very interesting keynote talk last night. And I asked him to also, that talk was to kind of set a frame and get a sense for the intersections of perspectives that are coming to bear on the question of how to bring into better alignment the practices of our culture with the kind of vision we have of what it means to be a diverse culture that embraces our differences. And we know that we speak ahead of our actions in that regard quite a bit. So we have a lot of catch up to do, and I think Lindsey was laying out some of the structural basis for that understanding that relates to our own immediate region. Amer travels around the country sharing these thoughts, and we wanted to get a little window on what inclusive pedagogy really looks like and how it might be put to work to address some of these challenges that show up in what is kind of a gap between our investment in diversity and our recognition of what the equity implications are that come from really addressing the needs of a culture that has the diversity to it. We know the great outcomes that can come when we put the pieces together in a healthy and productive way. And we know a lot of the division that can be created as well by structures and people invested in those structures who don't want to give up something that is special to them, and we wish it were shared more broadly as well. And so inclusive pedagogy is going to be something that's going to challenge some of the status quo approaches that are operating in education under the inertia of the practices that have been in place for reasons that are not always presented transparently, but we can read between the lines many times. So I don't want to say much more than that he does have a distinguished career in administrative work alongside this career that he's built as an advocate for these important problems. He's currently the Vice Provost for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the University of Vermont, and he's on the faculty with the Higher Ed and Student Affairs Administration program. I'd like to give him the time because he has to catch a flight, so he's going to be ending in time to walk out of here at noon. So if you can see what time it is. You know how long this is going to go for, but it's not going to feel like that because it's going to be engaging, and I welcome you to welcome as well Amer.
Good morning, everyone. Wonderful to be back. I know that some of you were here yesterday, and not quite sure who's online or not, but happy to be here to spend some time thinking about our classroom pedagogy. And whenever I do so, I try to start from a broad lens that's connected to some of what we talked about yesterday, in thinking about what are the core skills and competencies that we need to position us to be able to enact inclusive pedagogical practices, specifically intercultural skills. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that before we go into some of the specific classroom strategies. One of the reasons why I think that's important is that a lot of times what I notice, especially at the higher ed level, is that folks like myself, get asked, hey, can you come and help us because we had a difficult issue come up in the classroom. I call it the difficult dialogue. Some people call it the something's up moment in the class, or, and what I find is that a lot of times faculty are just trying to figure out, how do I get out of that moment? So that I can just get back to my content? Because this is like really preventing me from getting to where I'm trying to go. As opposed to, how do I set an environment where that's an opportunity for learning, right? So that's where we're gonna go, right? And because again, I've said yesterday, a lot of times we think that this work is about learning about every kind of identity and inequity. And the reality is that that's impossible, right? So what are the core skills we need to position us to be more likely to be successful in any context, but more specifically in the classroom? So first of all, we have to operate with a value for multiple perspectives, right? So in this, I'm a fan of the Far Side. So in this cartoon, you have a fisherman and a bear. They're both trying to catch fish. Now, what do you suppose the fisherman is thinking about how the bear is going about fishing? You got this big paw on a stick, like what's that gonna do, right? At the same time, what do you think the bear might be thinking about how the fisherman is going about fishing? You got this little string, like, now, are they both just as likely to catch fish? Probably. And my only point is that sometimes we have multiple ways to get to the same result. But oftentimes, we expect the process for everybody to get to a result to be the same. And we try to correct other people's way to get to the same result. And in the process of doing so, of eliminating different perspectives, different ideas, different processes, we start to limit the value of diversity that's in the classroom, right? And we don't just do this across groups, we do this within groups. So in this one it says, Jesse, are you mad, sick, crazy? We don't do that around here, and Jesse's cooking burgers. Now I'm gonna hope that's an impossible burger, but within groups, we kind of set parameters of what it means to be part of that group, what it means to be black, what it means to be Latin, what it means to be queer, identified, and so forth and so on. And at the same time, we need parameters, right? Not every perspective is going to get us to where we want to go. So in this one, it says, shh, here comes one now. Now, they think they have a great idea, but to all of us on the outside looking in, it's very clear that that's not going to work out very well for them, right? So we want multiple perspectives, but not every idea is going to get us to where we want to go, right? So we need some boundaries to that as well. In this one, it says, inadvertently, Roy dooms the entire Earth to annihilation when, in an attempt to be friendly, he seizes their leader by the head and shakes vigorously. Now, Roy means no harm, but the implications of his actions is disastrous, right? And so Roy is using a universal rule. He's using the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. But based on this discussion, what's the challenge with the golden rule? Anyone? I'll go ahead and answer. Not everybody wants the same thing you do. It assumes, the golden rule assumes that other people want the same thing as you. So I would advocate for the platinum rule, which is to do unto others as they would do or have done unto themselves, which requires what? Requires empathy, right? It requires shifting perspectives and validating someone else's experience and perspective as true for them. It does not require agreement, right? It's about meeting people where they're at in their needs. And as educators, that should always be central in how we're thinking about the learner, right? And so that breakthrough from the golden to the platinum rule is a key moment in the process of intercultural development that moves us from more ethnocentric stages, when we operate primarily out of our own worldview, to more ethno-relative stages of development in which we begin to shift perspectives and consider and develop an ability to navigate the complexity of similarities and differences effectively. So yesterday I alluded to this, but I'm going to walk through it a little bit with a little bit more detail. Now, I know that we're using the term cultural competence here, and I would argue that everybody is culturally competent, because if we weren't culturally competent, we wouldn't stop at stop signs. We're all aware of our own cultural context and our reality and how to navigate. The question is, how do we navigate our own cultural context in relationship to everybody else's, right? So in the denial stage, we're aware of our own cultural context and our own reality, but everything else is kind of a big blob of stuff out there. I don't really know much about it, not particularly curious about it. Phrases that people in denial often say is live and let live. So this is kind of, so I always think of like a person who's been on an isolated island and just really has no idea what's out there, right? Don't ask, don't tell. That's an example of denial, right? What was don't ask, don't tell, right? I don't even want to know about sexual. We're just going to act like that form of difference doesn't exist, right? Around LGBTQ identity. Defense is a stage of us versus them. It's a stage of dualism. And usually we think the us is better than the them, right? People in defense tend to use broad categories to refer to people like Asian or Latina, right? And can't really tell you a lot of nuance within that, right? Now, the interesting thing about defense is that every so often we see people that go work in the Peace Corps or study abroad or do a Fulbright, and they come back to the US and they say things like, you know who really gets it? The Africans. They get it. Americans, we're terrible, right? And in the intercultural framework, what that is saying, is how that's viewed is not necessarily development, because it's still dualism. And so we have a term for that. It's called reversal. When we reverse the us and the them, and we think the them is better than the us, right? That's not necessarily moving into that greater complexity, right? So to develop further intercultural competence, right, you need to move into greater complexity. The more you stay in dualism, the less you develop. And that's an important thing to think about in our polarized world right now, right? And our desire to align with people who we might agree with, but are operating from a state of rigidity that is not always helpful, right? So as an educator, for someone operating in defense, I'm wanting them to see more similarities, right? So for someone who is viewing non-white people, someone who's white who views non-white people as negative, they're ruining this country, whatever it might be, that person, I'm wanting them to see more similarities. You know, maybe there's more similarities than you realize, right? While being aware that there's also very, very big differences, right? With someone in reversal, let's just say in my experience being in the Northeast, encountering a lot of white liberalism, you know, and white progressivism, and being from Ohio and from the Midwest most of my life, meeting people who said, you know, the race, yeah, it must have been so racist out there. You know, after saying things that were deeply problematic about the predominantly Boricua, Puerto Rican community that I was living in. And I was like, oh, okay, so you think the racists are out there. Okay, so for them, I had to share a lot of stories that I had with white people in the Midwest that were very positive, that were much more hospitable than what I was experiencing in Massachusetts, to help them realize, like, hey, like, they're not that different from you to the point that they're the racist and you're not the racist. Maybe you have more in common with these other people. Because part of what I've been saying, because there's been this overconflation with right and left politics, with DEI and social justice work that's happening, that, and again, not to say that there's not a big overlap, but it's not one-to-one, okay? I've been saying that a lot of times, not always, obviously this is oversimplification, that the right and left U.S. political spectrum is predominantly a debate amongst white people about the enfranchisement of the rest of us. And so that dynamic between the Massachusetts liberal and the Ohio conservative that I grew up, what I found about the white liberal in Massachusetts is that they're trying to tell them a story of how they're the good ones, right? And so they're having a hard time seeing the similarity, right? And how do we reconcile that, right? So as the educator, whether someone is in pure defense and thinks that them is negative, or whether someone's in reversal and they think that them is better and we're the good ones, and we're the bad ones, regardless, that dualism gets people stuck, right? So as an educator, I'm trying to get them to greater similarity. But what happens when we start to see how similar we are as people, we start to mask the differences. And we overemphasize the similarities, and we move into a stage known as minimization, where we minimize difference, we overemphasize similarities, and we start to we stop recognizing the things that characterize our differences. So people in minimization tend to say things like, at the end of the day, we're all human beings. We're all, we all have food and culture, these universal truths, right? Family, music, we're all people. And it's absolutely true. This is the golden rule territory. This is where most people get stuck, right? Because it oftentimes goes unchallenged, right? Okay, yeah, that's true. Yeah, we are all, at the end of the day, human beings, right? But in a system of inequity, in which when someone is saying that we're all human beings, the assumption is other people are like us, whoever the us is. Right? And so what that means is that when someone shows themselves to be very different in some way, shape, or form, it's like, well, what's the issue? What's the problem? Why are you creating an issue? Why are you making waves? Right? A characteristic of minimization, and as a Midwesterner I know it very well, is insistent niceness. Right? I'm insisting that you are nice on the standard in which I expect you to be nice. Right? So the big breakthrough from the golden rule to the platinum rule is moving into acceptance, where we recognize that we're similar and different at the same time, and that's a good thing. Diversity is good. We value it. And kind of connected to the speaker before me, it's a stage of talk with no action. That we value diversity, we think it's a good thing, but we're not really doing anything behaviorally different. On an organizational level, connected to what she was talking about, it's not translating into enactment of policies, practices, and procedures, right? It's just talk. It looks good, sounds good, but what are we really doing, right? On an individual level, that's on a behavioral level, right? Where the next stage is adaptation. How do we adapt our communication skills to be effective across different kinds of contexts? It's these adaptive skills. Now, a component of this is code switching, and this is where a lot of DEI folks get a little uncomfortable, because in the DEI space, code switching is oftentimes presented as purely a negative thing, right? However, the reality is that we all code switch to a degree. It's inequitable in terms of who's having to code switch more than others, right? But does anybody talk at work the exact same way they talk at home? Yeah, most of us would get fired if we talked at work the way we talk at home, right? So we're all kind of doing what was called contextual evaluation, right? We're evaluating the context and we're adapting our behavior and communication to the best degree we understand that we're supposed to. However, there's inequity in who is having to adapt more than others, because some norms are accepted as dominant and therefore acceptable, and so there's less of an adaptation happening for folks who are positioned as the dominant group as related to that, right? But the idea is that we all have to do it, but we need to deal with the inequities, right? And integration is just a deepening of that same process, a synthesis of our ability to effectively move and navigate across different contexts. And I mentioned this yesterday, that these are the core competencies and skills that position us to move along that continuum. And there is no endpoint, right? It looks like there is in that, but it's a lifelong journey that we're all working on. And as I mentioned yesterday, self-awareness is the absolute foundation. As a teacher, as an educator, if you have not spent any time reflecting on who you are, your identities, your experiences, your bias, yourself, you cannot empathize with your students effectively to really understand who they are and what they need from you, and to be able to create an environment in which they feel valued and respected for who they are and what they bring to the table. I mentioned yesterday tolerance for ambiguity, being okay with the fact that you don't know all the details all the time. That's okay, right? This is another thing that we see some of the folks in what Dr. Jamie Washington calls the woke Olympics oftentimes lack, is the lack of tolerance for ambiguity. Because I've been so steeped in social justice and I know what every issue is, I know what's happening right here. Well, do you? And do you know the identity of everybody? I already gave the other example yesterday that's not on the other end of the spectrum, right? The where are you really from piece, right? So, and again, we do want curiosity, but can we have the patience to sit with the ambiguity, right? We don't need to predetermine who our students are. We don't know who they are, right? We have to create the environment for them to feel like they can bring who they are forward as a resource for learning. And as an educator, we want to facilitate that learning, create the environment for them to feel like that's valued as a resource for what's happening. And that's part of how you as the teacher start to learn, right? And start to get some of that content-specific knowledge around particular identities and experiences, right? That you wouldn't know otherwise, because it's not your walk of life, right? I mentioned contextual evaluation, and this one it says, well, I guess I'll have the ham and eggs, and he's sitting in a room full of pigs and chickens. You know, because some people say, well, why should we have to code switch, right? Why should we have to adapt my behavior? That's being inauthentic, okay? Well, contextual evaluation is a reality, right? We're gonna have to do it, right? If I was communicating to you right now the way that I do in my South Asian Muslim community that I grew up in, nobody here would know what was going on. Is it a greater adaptation for me than somebody who's white European American descent? Yes, absolutely. But there would be absolutely nothing constructive going on here right now, because you would have no idea what I'm here to convey and communicate, right? But can we create a place in between where all of us are adapting rather than some of us? In this one it says, wonderful, just wonderful, so much for instilling in them a sense of awe. Now, when you look at this image, what is your eye immediately drawn to? What do you notice first? Anyone?
The guy who fell down the stairs.
Okay, the alien at the bottom. Anyone else?
The men in the back.
Okay, the people in the back. Maybe the aliens at the top. So that's usually what people say. What people rarely say is the staircase. And if you look at that staircase, the stairs are uneven, there's no handrails. Somebody was going to fall down those stairs, right? Now I want you to think about those stairs like a system. One of my mentors taught me that every system is exquisitely designed to produce the results that it gets. Every system is exquisitely designed to produce the results that it gets. Now, it does not matter whether it was designed intentionally to be inequitable or not. The question is, what is it doing, right? And so this is a system that is setting people up for failure. And what do? We tend to blame the group that is the recipient of the inequity, right? We blame women for sexism. We blame people of color for racism and so forth, instead of thinking about, what do we need to do to fix those stairs so that nobody falls down them, right? What do we do to fix the systems that are setting people up for failure, right? Well, part of it is that we have to infuse these skills and these competencies with an equity lens, right? And I mentioned this yesterday. I'm not going to do this activity with you all here. Many of you have probably done the activity where you list parts of your social identity, and so forth, and it really gets at saliency of identity. And I want you to be thinking about that anytime you've done that activity, to be thinking about the ever-changing aspects of our identity. Our biology, from the time we're young to the time that we're old, our culture or cultures. So 1950s U.S. society is not the same, or even California culture and society is not the same as it is today. And then there's our experiences. And each experience piles on top of each experience on top of each experience, and all of that is subject to our social and cultural context. And somewhere in the midst of that is our constant negotiation of our identity, constantly changing, contesting, and you're not just doing it, everybody else is doing it, right? So we're these constant moving targets, right? Which means we're never going to get it right all the time. It's impossible, right? So if that's the case, right, it's really important for us to be able to move and acknowledge the complexity, right? And so what's at odds to that is rigidity, right? For example, stereotypes. They're very fixed and rigid. So an example of a statement that would be a stereotype is Mexicans are highly emotional. Fixed and rigid. As opposed to a generalization, which is not perfect, but based on what I know at this point, Mexicans in general are likely to be more expressive and emotional than we are. Okay? What's the difference? What characterizes the difference? I'm not saying the generalization is perfect. You're recognizing constraints on your point of view. Yes, you're positioning yourself as having a limitation based on your own experience, and that you may receive additional information that may cause you to have to reevaluate your entire category that you've created, right? Because as human beings, we create categories. That's what we do, right? We have schema structures in our brain. That's how we make sense of reality. The question isn't whether we create categories around people, right? The question is how malleable and flexible are those categories? How able are we to allow additional information to allow us to consider to reconsider our categories? So I have two bell curves. One says collectivism, one says individualism. Now, some societies are more individualistic, some are more collectivistic. So let's just take the United States and China. Now, generally, the United States is a more individualistic society than China. And generally, China is a more collectivistic society than the United States. But are there some Chinese people in China that are more individualistic? Yes. And are there some Americans in the United States that are more collectivistic? Of course, right? So, we still need to be able to have categories, because otherwise we couldn't say that generally China is more collectivistic than the United States, right? But we have to have room for not everybody to fit into those categories, right? I mentioned the iceberg conception of culture yesterday. I'm not going to get into the details, but just the idea of holding the idea that 9/10 of culture is primarily out of our awareness, and you can say this about any identity group, whether it's around gender, class, sexual orientation, there's a culture around every identity, right? So recognizing that there's all these different ways of difference that are playing out. And I mentioned yesterday in the classroom, if you have a teacher that expects eye contact, right, from their students, and they're measuring character and someone's truthfulness and so forth as a measure of whether or not they have character, well, now that student who may come from a background in which that would be the rudest thing that they could do is in a very precarious position, right? This is part of why we have to do the self-awareness work. This is part of why we have to do the empathy work, right? In order to be able to recognize, what are those things for me? What are those values for me? Where do they come from? How was I socialized into them? And what is similar or different about that from others, right? Or could be. And the tolerance for ambiguity is for accounting for the fact that I don't know every other kind of way of operating, but I'm open to the idea that there's a different way that I'm unfamiliar with, right? So staying in that place of ambiguity for as long as possible, holding the ambiguity. I know everybody here is probably very familiar, but we have to say it very clearly, that intent does not equal impact. It is not the intent of behavior, and this is something that our teachers struggle with oftentimes too. Well, I didn't intend to cause harm to the student. Well, the impact has happened, right? So part of how we mitigate the impact of our behavior on students is by how we set up the classroom, right? And how we create the environment where students want to bring who they are forward. In higher education, what I learned as I went into the faculty development space and the Center for Teaching space was that most faculty were not creating norms and agreements around how do we engage in a respectful way that works for everyone, right? They're just like jumping in the content and when you do that, you're basically saying that who you are in this class does not matter, right? I matter because I'm the expert, and I'm going to download this information to you, and you're going to. One thing that an educator should never say is, "I'm going to teach the same course I taught last semester or last quarter." That never happens because you have different people in the class, right? And so it should be different every time because they make it different because they bring who they are into the class, right? And so if you say that like the subtext of what you're saying that I teach in the same class I taught last time is that who our students are doesn't matter, right? It's the same thing. And the thing is that for the teacher, the course becomes rote, honestly, right? It becomes less interesting. So, I mean, I think it's important that we even leverage the self-interest for teachers and for faculty members of like, hey, and this is part of where communities of practice matter, is faculty talking to each other, teachers talking to each other about like what value they got out of centering students and decentering themselves and what they learned and what they gained and what amazing things emerged out of the class because they did that, right? I mentioned yesterday targeted agent identities, areas of privilege and marginality, that we have both. This is part of the self-awareness and the empathy work, and the idea that we all have to do work around our areas of privilege, our agent identities, to dismantle the way systems of power function and operate. And recognizing that we respond according to our ability. We individually cannot change the whole world, right? What is the things that we can impact? And as a teacher, the classroom is a space that we can impact, right? With the recognition that we're bumping up against a societal socialization that has happened far before everybody has gotten into the classroom, right? And so there's this cycle of socialization that's playing out that we're born into. We're not, born with an awareness of it, but we're socialized through institutions, through media, through schools, through places of worship, right? And then it's reinforced, and it reinforces these kind of marginalizing experiences. So when we are not actively doing anything different, it's perpetuating that cycle, right? We have to actively, intentionally try to do something different if we're going to break this cycle in the classroom and beyond, right? Recognizing that we have these unconscious biases that result of this socialization, and we have to think about what is the value of diversity, right? So this is my definition for diversity: the fact. It is not a verb. It is not something you do, English professor. It is a fact. In any group of people, there are diversity. We do not all have the same experience. You could have a group of all white. One of my pet peeves is when I hear people say diverse and non-diverse students. I'm like, what? Who is non-diverse? We are all contributing to the diversity of what's happening, okay? It is a fact of difference that may make a difference in how we interact with one another, communities, institutions, and with ourselves. So, what do we mean by that, right? In the United States, eye color is not a difference that makes a difference. We don't have social structures, we don't have social inequities that are built around eye color. In 1930s Germany, eye color was definitely a difference that made a difference. Had tremendous implications, right? So in the United States, it's race, gender, sexual orientation, class, ethnicity, right? So forth, ability status, right? And so on and so on. So inclusion in the classroom is about welcoming and embracing the strengths of our differences, encouraging involvement, and providing equal access to opportunities and information. Well, how do we go about doing that? Well, first of all, we have to acknowledge what we've just been through and what we continue to be going through, and particularly our students, right? And I think this is particularly important in the CSU system, right? Given the struggles and the challenges that many of our students bring, right? The lost wages that have happened, the access to food challenges that increased, right? The neighborhoods that may or may not be safe, the child care and homeschooling challenges, which was a challenge before, but even more so now, right? The inadequate access to health care and insurance, the challenges, particularly in California, around public transportation, right? The lack of access to technology, and just the general social inequities and systems of inequity that our students have to navigate, right? So, we have to be flexible, right? We have to be willing to adapt, right? Thankful that our students are showing up, right? We have to start from that place, right? As opposed to this disciplinary way of thinking of what we're doing, right? And not assume that everything is okay for our students, right? And create those asynchronous opportunities just like you're doing right now, right? So it's about accessibility, right? And being aware of the resources that are available to our students, particularly offered by our university or our school, right? The counseling and psychological services, the health services, the learning support, right? Being able to get our students connected to the support resources that they need, right? You are not the only resource for them, right? You are part of a system that has resources, right? And if you are unaware of it, of those resources, you're perpetuating the inequity of access to those resources, right? Might not be intentionally, but that's the impact, right? Wellness check-ins, right? How are you all doing? I don't know how many of you all experienced this, but the power of vulnerability as educators that emerged through the pandemic when we said, I love y'all, I'm sorry, I'm just gonna be honest, like I'm just, I got childcare issues, I got this, I'm gonna, and how many of you experienced this sense of like students feeling you were more approachable once they realized like, oh, like you're a human being with real challenges, real life circumstances. So maybe you actually might be open to me coming to you to share some of mine, right? And to let you know that this is part of what's creating challenges for me in being able to show up as my full centered and focused and invested self as a student, right? And then being able to have that conversation. Okay, how do I support you, right? To be able to, but it starts with that vulnerability, right? If you don't have that approachability, which is automatically there, right? Because they've been socialized to treat you as an authority figure, right? So therefore, I'm intimidated. I'm intimidated to be vulnerable to my teacher and let them know that something's not okay, something's not easy, something is hard about me being able to show up for this course, right? Having relevant discussion prompts, right? Connecting the content to things that are going on in the world around them, right? To be able to make that connection between, and create space and room that it's okay to acknowledge the fact that we've got an election coming up, or we've got whatever the next intense social, challenge that is in our reality. Like, we don't have to live in a vacuum from what's going on in the world around us, right? And reassure them that we will find ways to support you in whatever meaningful way that we can to help them get through things together, right? That they're not alone, right? And that just because they're facing a challenge doesn't mean that you're not invested in them finding a way to be able to do that, right? And then having our own accessibility to them, right? And letting them know that there may be multiple ways. And that's hard, I know that, because you want to set boundaries and parameters of like your own personal life, right? But finding ways to create pathways for them to be able to access you as a resource of support. And when I talked about kind of these realities of the world around them, look, COVID was the ultimate case study. It's the ultimate case study around inequity, on a health level, on so many different levels, on a work level, on so many different levels. It is the ultimate case study. Because when I was talking about, when I've talked about inclusive pedagogy, the people that we get the most resistance from typically is from STEM faculty, right? Wow, what does that stuff have to do with what we're talking about and doing? It may have everything to do with what you're talking about, right? So, but are you creating the space for us to be able to connect what's going on in the world in relationship to the content of your course? Or have you just predetermined that that's not relevant, right? So, okay, so some concrete things. How many of you do icebreakers? Okay. I encourage icebreakers. There's tons of them out there. There's books with nothing but icebreakers, right? Again, learning who are we in relationship to one another and what's happening here in this course, right? So it's about creating community. The classroom is a community. Nothing should have taught us more about that than during the pandemic, because for some of our students, the classroom might have been the only community they were experiencing, right? So, encouraging that empathy, that generosity, that listening, that understanding in the classroom, right? It's powerful. It's powerful. It allows them to feel like they can show up as their whole selves and that there's a value of who they are showing up, and they feel like, oh, wow, I have to show up because I'm part of this community that wants, that is supportive, and not that I have to, that I want to show up, right? Digital storytelling. They're doing it all the time. Turn it into an opportunity for learning, right? Okay, maybe you're you have a hard time speaking in front of the group. Okay, maybe our assignment can be done through sharing a video story about your assignment, right? They're doing it all the time. Hey y'all, what y'all doing? I'm doing this. You know what I mean? Like, they're doing it anyways, right? That is an opportunity, right? That's still learning if they're connecting it to the content of the course, right? They do it all the time, y'all. We know this, right? Just because you're not on TikTok doesn't mean that they are, right? So, and I'm just tell you flat out, I'm not. I've never downloaded that app ever. And again, giving them video clips, articles as a prompt for asynchronous discussion in your learning management system, right? I gave this example to some folks yesterday, but first of all, in my first year seminar course with the students, the discussion prompt is always, what did the reading mean to you? Right? And of course, what do? They summarize. Right? I'm like, I'm not asking you to summarize. I read it. Okay? I want to know what it meant to you. And what that's telling them is that the subtext is, I'm asking you to connect it to your experience. Right? Now, if I've created an environment where they know bringing who they are forward is a resource, and they see that I value that, when I tell them, that was really interesting, that I didn't know that, so the course I was teaching was like on hip hop and social justice and religion around the world. Oh, I didn't realize that there were people connecting Santeria to hip hop and local things in Dominican Republic, because that's what the student shared. And I was like, whoa, like I had no idea about that. That's great. That's interesting. That's fascinating, right? And then there was a couple other students, because they're all asked to reply to other students. They had to reply to at least 2 other people each week, right? And the most marginalized students were the ones that were the most resistant, right? Because they have not been told that who they are matters in the learning process. Because they are the ones most likely to be told, just follow the program. Just do whatever they tell you to do. That's how you're going to get to where you want to go, right? That's how you're going to get to college. That's how you're going to do well in college. And now all of a sudden your teacher is telling you, no, who you are matters in what's going on here. And it's like, me? The person that's been told my whole life that who I am is less than? What value do I bring, right? And so they haven't been taught that their stories, their experiences have value. And so why would I think that that's relevant for what's going on here in the classroom, right? Unless you, as the teacher, reinforce over and over and over again this value, they're not going to get it. Because they have a whole socialization process that's telling them that that's not true, right? Collaborative tasks. Now we have all these collaborative digital tools, right? All these Google tools, Slack, Trello, obviously Zoom or whatever platform, Teams, whatever platform you all are using, those are opportunities to do collaborative tasks as teams, role-playing activities, right? And again, the great thing about these tools is that they can be used synchronously and asynchronously. The great thing about like Slack and Trello is that, okay, I can just check off, I did this, okay, now the project can move forward because, I did this, now, and it'll communicate automatically to the other team member, oh, such and such person completed their task. That means you can do the next step of the project, right? And so I would encourage you to check out the book, Learning to Collaborate, Collaborating to Learn. Right? It's got a lot of very specific tools to be able to use for the classroom, around collaboration in the classroom. Brookfield said, one of the hardest things teachers have to learn is that the sincerity of their intentions does not guarantee the purity of the practice. Right? Intent does not equal impact. Inclusive teaching is intentional teaching. And part of the intention is to break the inheritance of Eurocentric patriarchal norms that have been embedded into our classrooms, right? And so Laura Rendon, in the book Sense Pente, talks about these agreements, they're unstated, that are in our classrooms. The privileging of intellectual and rational knowing. An agreement of separation, of distinctly separate disciplines and ideas that have nothing to do with one another. Very Eurocentric and patriarchal. An agreement of competition, that somehow my learning is connected to the success or failure of somebody else in the class, right? By definition, a curve perpetuates this, right? Because you're saying that how you did in this class has to do with what other people are doing here, or not. An agreement of perfection, that anything less than perfect is less than 100%. The assumption that there could be perfection somehow. An agreement of monoculturalism. This is, again, this getting in that reinforcing the idea that who you are in the classroom doesn't matter, right? We're just going to act like everybody's the same. None of that matters, that minimization. None of that matters. What matters is that I'm your teacher telling you what you need to know, right? And an agreement of avoiding self-examination. Again, that self-awareness, that lack of self-awareness, right? I always find it to be interesting, especially at the higher education level, that in any research project, you have to name your self-reflexivity, as related to your research subject matter. You have to articulate how you're positioned in relationship to what you're researching. But yet, none of that translates into the classroom. None of that, at the higher ed level, faculty are not asked to think about their identities as related to the classroom. But they are asked to do that as related to their research project. There is no such thing as a culturally neutral learning situation, right? Pedagogy is not culturally universal, right? The idea of reasoned argumentation or impersonal objectivity or the sports-like competition of testing and grading, right? These are cultural assumptions. They're Eurocentric, they're patriarchal, and we have inherited them, right? So, we understand pedagogy is cultural. And when we accept norms as universal, we're likely to see deficit rather than difference. When we accept norms as universal, we are likely to see deficit rather than difference. Those students are a problem, right? They just can't cut it. So, this is how we basically pathologize our students, by saying that they are the problem because they're not willing to conform to the norms we've set for them to operate within. And that makes them the problem, not the system that was exquisitely designed to produce the results that it gets. And yet somehow we are surprised over and over again that it produces the same result over and over again, right? So we have to move to a more transcultural pedagogy that respects the diversity in the classroom, that engages the motivation of all learners, that creates safe, inclusive, respectful learning environments, derives teaching practices from principles that cross disciplines and cultures, promotes justice and equity in society. Phelps says, I've come to realize that it is not so much what students know, but what they can do. Likewise, teaching is not about what I know, but what I enable others to do. What we unlock from our students, right? In their own capacity to live into their potential of who they are and who they're seeking to be in the world, right? So Rendon proposes a new set of agreements to work with diverse ways of knowing. Not every way of knowing is intellectual. Right? That is one type of knowing, right? If you look at various cultures around the world, there are a number of epistemologies that are not intellectual, right? Every indigenous culture in the world, that's true, right? Embracing connectedness, collaboration, and transdisciplinarity. That knowledge is not distinctly separated, but it is interconnected. And in reality, all the solutions to the challenges that we live in today requires that, right? Sustainability, health equity, right? All these different pieces that require, because the disciplinary thinking has led us to a calamity and a crisis in the society, to have built an inequitable and unsustainable human civilization, right? So our young people, the connectedness of their thinking, right, is actually where the solutions to the challenges in our world will lie, right? They will develop it, but they have to know that it's okay, right, to make those connections, right, between those different things, and not be told, well, that has nothing to do with that. How do you know that? Do you know that? Or do you think that? Right? Or are you making an assumption? Right? To engage in diverse learning strategies, we talked about some of those a second ago. To be open, to be grounded in knowing and not knowing. As I said yesterday, that a lot of our education system is around knowing and the performance of knowing, as opposed to learning, which requires us to engage that which we do not know, which requires humility, as you said yesterday. Right? It requires us to understand that we do not know. And not only do we not know everything about our own discipline, we don't know a lot about a whole lot of things, right? Because there's also this illusion that if I'm educated, then my knowledge is transferable. So I know a lot about, as an administrator, I see this all the time. Faculty who come into administrative work and they think it's all intuitive. Like, oh, I'm a smart person, I'll figure it out. And then they realize, like, oh, this is a lot harder than I realized. And after they just spent 20 years railing against us. You know? A new agreement of multiculturalism and respect of diverse cultures, that we are not monocultural environments, that there is a pluralism in the classroom that has value, to balance our personal and professional lives with work, rest, and replenishment. Imagine that, right? And this gets into yesterday also what I was talking about, the healing piece, right? And I know it is incredibly hard. We are in a system that is running us ragged, right? But that's the system of white supremacy at work, right? We know that. We know that that's what this system is built to do, right? So when we invest in ourselves, when we take time for self-reflexivity and actually invest in ourselves and each other, right? That is a radical act in this system, right? It is a revolutionary act, right? In order for us to be able to show up for our students. Because when we're tired, when we're exhausted, we operate from our automated processes, which causes us to operate from our implicit biases and more likely to microaggress, right? It matters, right? We think we never have time for it, but then we have to think about what am I doing with my time, right? Is the absolute every task that I'm putting myself through absolutely necessary, right? And what is the cost of that for myself and for my students, and maybe even for my family and friends? Most likely so, right? So I would encourage you to take a photo of this so you can think about, because I think I could spend hours with folks, and I have, in workshops, just really reflecting on the implications of what does it mean and look like for us to move from the pre-existing agreements that Rendon defines to these new agreements, right? We don't have time for that, and I apologize, but that's just, but there's some really powerful things that you can unlock by really coming into understanding of what's there, right? So if we think about the classroom climate, Ambrose defines it as the intellectual, social, emotional, and physical environments in which our students learn. And the factors that affect the climate in the classroom is the content of the course and the course design, right? So I think that it's really important that we understand that no matter how hard we work on our pedagogy, nothing is more powerful than when we backwards design our courses, right? To really center learning and what we want our students to learn, and to think about the course content as in support of that learning, as opposed to the course is about the content, right? So nothing will unlock our pedagogical skills of inclusion more than starting at that course design level. I know that we don't always have time, right? But when we have that opportunity, and when our systems and our schools and our institutions invest in faculty and teachers having the time to redesign courses from that framework, that nothing is more powerful in what can unlock what's possible in the classroom, and in thinking about what the students are doing in relationship to one another and you as a teacher, that as opposed to simply just delivering the content. Other factors that affect the climate are the topics that are discussed versus dismissed, right? Whose knowledge is privileged in the content, right? The teacher-student relationships and interactions, the tone of the discussion, the student-to-student interactions, and the demographics of the participants involved. And we can have a marginalizing or centralizing climate, We can have a marginalizing climate in which diverse perspectives are excluded and discouraged, in which you end up having reduced learning, achievement, perceptions of competence and belonging. Or you can have a centralizing environment in which diverse perspectives are included and welcomed and your identity is safe in the classroom. So we have to ask ourselves, what can we do to create a climate, a set of expectations or practices to encourage students to engage with these issues, to increase their comfort level in being uncomfortable, right? Because learning is always going to involve discomfort. Because you're engaging things that you don't know. It's hard, and especially if it bumps up against your values, your identities, your experiences, right? This is part of what the challenge is in terms of dialogue, right? That we have not set the expectation that discomfort is part of the learning process, right? It's inevitable. So it starts at the first class session with the syllabus, setting the goal and intention for the course. Now, this is some language, that's a lot of words. This is language that I use in mine. And you'll notice I'm acknowledging their humanity. I'm acknowledging that they are a valuable resource for what's going to happen in this course, right? Respect for yourself and others is essential, right? That's critical for what we're going to do here, right? So they are being told right from the jump who they are matters, right? That's going to make a difference in terms of what happens in this course. And so we have to assume everyone has a perspective that is worth considering. We have to model listening for understanding and good intercultural communication and social justice facilitation, right? And this is a thing, this is a challenge. A lot of our teachers are not being taught how to facilitate discussion, right? Especially with the adaptive intercultural skills and an equity lens to really create an environment where all perspectives are valued and respected for that dialogue. And in the process, we have to acknowledge different perspectives, encourage further inquiry, frame and reframe the conversation, right? Bringing your expertise forward through that framing and reframing, right? That's the opportunity to use your expertise. A lot of times teachers and faculty members think that, like, man, I'm just like, what was the point of all the expertise I developed, right? And the content expertise. Well, if you know your stuff, if you know that content so well, you're going to know the opportunities to bring that content forward, right? And make the connection between with the conversation that is happening with the students. And in that course design level, you need to schedule application exercises and practice activities. So if we're going to have a more dialogic space for students, we have to prepare students to engage, right? And I mentioned the norms and agreements that we have to create for dialogue, right? So what I do is I actually, in the first day of the course, I asked them, what are the things that you need to be able to show up as your whole and authentic self and to bring all of yourself forward into the classroom? And then they start sharing out. You can give them also an opportunity to write down those and turn that in confidentially if they want, right? You start putting it up. For me, I'll put it on a chart paper or whatever. And then, start to ask them, what do you all think about this? And then, is this, you all, develop consensus around it or not? And then what I do is I put it into a Google Doc and I make that link available to all of them. And I say, this is a working document that we can always revisit, but my job is to hold you accountable to yourselves. This is what you all said that you need for us to engage respectfully and inclusively in this class, right? You're not accountable to me, you're accountable to yourselves and each other. And I am here to hold you accountable to yourselves and each other. Totally changes who you are as a teacher in the classroom, and what you represent, right? So you're not just simply an authority figure, and you're making it clear to them they have stake in what happens in the classroom. And in decentering yourself as a teacher and a faculty member, what that means is that your identity, your experience, your background does not drive the climate of what's happening in the class. They are driving it. And you're one piece of that puzzle. You're a significant piece of that puzzle, a very significant piece of it. You always will be. You're never going to be able to fully decenter yourself, and you shouldn't, right? That's not the point. The point is that it shouldn't all be dependent on you, right? And therefore, when you make the mistake, inevitably, around something related to identity, the whole class falls apart, because now it's like you have, because you didn't build that trust, you didn't create that environment and room for us to make mistakes, including yourselves. And maybe you weren't vulnerable either, right? To admit that I'm not going to be perfect either in this process. Again, all part of the priming process of what we're doing here in this classroom, right? That if I then microaggress or do something that causes harm, that it's not the end of the world. We're going to work through it, y'all. All right, we've created this community, right, of trust, knowing that we're not all the same, knowing that it can be difficult at times. So let's work through this. And I'm willing to admit that I'm not perfect, and I may make mistakes along the way too, right? So if something comes up, we're going to work through it, right? That's that difficult dialogue, and I'll get to that in a moment, right? So we're encouraging empathy, generosity, listening for understanding, right? Right? We're creating that community. And we practice engagement along the way in the course. Pair share exercises, right? Small group discussions. I talked about the video clips and the articles as prompts, and having students respond. Like I said, you can do it in writing. If there's hesitation around sharing verbally, again, creating those alternative opportunities for students to be able to contribute, that it could include writing the things down. Those small group discussions in relationship to large group, right? Because some students, they're not going to engage in the large group things, but you'll see that same student is like talking it up in that small group, but they might have nothing to say when you bring it out for the large group debrief. Okay, that's all right, right? You may have one person as a designee to be able to report out to the large group, but that's still engagement, right? It's just where they're feel more safe and comfortable to do so. And then creating that capacity and responsibility for if we do have a difficult dialogue, right? If something does come up, right? So these difficult dialogues, it's when there's an exchange that reveal conflicting views, beliefs, and values, oftentimes related to social justice related topics, right? There's a potential for identity threat, for one's identity to feel threatened by what we're talking about, and it can arouse intense emotions, right? So now you've already set the tone at the beginning of the course from the beginning, and some of the activities and the ways you're engaging, right? That this is a place of engagement, right? So it's not a surprise, right? You've primed them for along the way. There may be some things that are uncomfortable. Again, priming them around discomfort as part of the learning process, right? So that you're making it clear to them, I anticipate that could happen in this course, so that when it does, you actually are able to address it. And again, I talked about the discomfort. Coming into courses, there's oftentimes concerns around the possibility of these things happening, both for the teacher and for the student. And if you look at the themes in the research around faculty's concerns around these difficult dialogues, there's a concern for losing control of the class, showing ignorance. Again, I've already said, you prime them for the idea that you are not the keeper of all the knowledge, right? That humility, that vulnerability. losing control of emotion, being accused of bias, the undermining of your authority. Again, you've already set the tone that you've kind of decentering yourself somewhat, right? That I'm not here to hold you accountable to me. I'm here to hold you accountable to each other and yourselves, and potentially offending others. Well, if you look at student concerns, they're very similar. There's only a couple things that are different, and most of it's around that authority element. Concerns of stereotypes and prejudice, showing ignorance, losing control of their emotion, being accused of biases, being invalidated or dismissed, and offending others. So, as the teacher, a large portion of your concerns are similar to theirs, right? So we're all members of this community that are seeking to try to find a way to be able to be respectful to one another, to work through the difficult things, right? So you're setting that environment so that we can position ourselves to be able to navigate these difficult moments. And our response matters in those moments. So when identity threat is not addressed, students experience micro-invalidations, they experience negative emotions, they're more likely to disengage from the course, they do not learn or perform as well, and they lose trust in the classroom as a community, right? For faculty that do not respond to identity threat, we often experience regret, right? When we do respond effectively, we see that it builds trustful relationships with the students. It creates a climate that enhances student learning, and we feel good about meeting our pedagogical goals for the course. So, we have to think about those moments as teachable moments, right? So we've primed the course, we've primed the students, primed the community, primed the environment, so that when those moments come up, when they occur, as the teacher, I'm thinking about moving into real-time facilitation. I am now a facilitator, right? That is my role in what's happening here right now, right? And we have to perceive the discussion as valuable rather than distracting from the content that I'm trying to get to, right? If you're only thinking about how do I get back to the content, it's going to prevent you from being able to understand the value and to see the value of what's happening, right? That this is an opportunity. Even if it's difficult, even if it's challenging, even if it means you have to hold your content priorities for a hot second, however long that may be, right? So we resolve to take the easy way out. And we explicitly and intentionally guide students in difficult dialogue, which means revisiting those agreements if necessary, right? And then we engage we have to work on creating facilitation skills for our teachers, right? For these dialogues. So we're letting students know, okay, we talked about what it means to be in community, what we need. So these are the norms and agreements that we've agreed upon. Let's have a conversation around this, because it seems like there's some disagreements, concerns, there may be some frustrations, right? So let's engage in these dialogues that we talked about that we might have. So what are some in the moment strategies? Because it's sometimes not always easy to know, right, what's going on. You're allowed to pause. You're allowed to take a beat, right? Gather your thoughts, reflection. Is this a moment? Do I need to shift to facilitator mode? Do I need to be, I feel like I'm sensing something's going on. There's some conflict or some tensions, right? Because we don't always know. So if somebody has said something, acknowledge the comment, right? And so what I find is that by doing that, you're also buying yourself a little bit more time. So what I heard was you get both. You're both like framing, reframing, acknowledging, but you're also buying yourself a little time to gather your thoughts, right? And then you move into facilitation, right? You're prioritizing the process of the facilitation of the dialogue over the content. You're asking clarifying questions. Can you help me understand what you mean by that? I love that question. Because it causes the student to have to flesh out their thought. Right? What did you mean? What did you mean by that? I heard you say X, Y, and Z. Can you help me understand that? You may encourage students to talk with each other. If it doesn't feel like large group facilitation is going to be what's helpful. Okay, let's get into pairs and let's talk about what we're, what was just said. Maybe the multiple students said something in conflict. What are your thoughts about that? Encourage reflection. It could be something written if necessary. Share your own reflections. Affirm that you're recognizing that there's emotions around it. Right? I'm seeing that there's different feelings around what has been mentioned or what has been said. And then find ways to connect it back to the course, to the content, right? Whenever possible, but not forcing it, but recognizing the opportunities. And say, what we're talking about, if you think about what such and such person said in the reading, that's kind of what they were getting at. They were kind of, you know what I mean? You find those opportunities, right, to make that connection when they're there. And you come with a backup plan, right? If you feel like, okay, this is really heated, this is really intense, we're not going to get anywhere constructive here. Or it's getting beyond my capacity, right? Again, share your observations, ask others to share theirs. But I have something for your back pocket, and you can take a photo of this next slide. This is the critical incident questionnaire. You can have them write their responses for this, okay? At the end of the session. Maybe give, 5-10 minutes at the end. At what moment in the class were you most engaged as a learner? At what moment in the class were you most distanced as a learner? And what action that anyone in the room took did you find most affirming or helpful? What action that anyone in the room took did you find most puzzling or confusion? What surprised you the most? And then have them turn it in at the end of the course, or at the end of the session. And now you've got data. Now you're getting a little bit of a better idea. Okay, what were people thinking and feeling about what happened, right? Because sometimes we're just going to run out of time also. And again, we're not necessarily always going to get there. So, maybe I'm not even fully understanding what's going on. Okay? This is data to help me get an understanding of how I might engage the class around this. Because it wasn't resolved, and we're probably not going to get anywhere if I don't address it. Right? So now, okay, so what I've learned from you all is that some of you all felt this way, some of you felt that way, X, Y, and Z. So it gives you that opportunity to follow up and have a better sense of where people are at. This is another way, called the 5-minute rule, the last 5 minutes of your class, to engage a marginalized perspective, right? Because sometimes that has gotten dismissed, right? What is interesting or helpful about this view? What are some intriguing features that others might not have noticed? What would be different if you believed this view, if you accepted it as true? In what sense and under what conditions might this idea be true? Write it down. Turn it in, right? And again, they get the opportunity to reflect, to think about what they think. They get to challenge themselves as well, beyond their own perspective, right? And again, you can potentially revisit it at the next session. So that is what I had prepared for you. I'm happy to take a few questions. I have 5 minutes, but yeah, thank you. Anyone?
We're live. That's what happens when you preach to the choir. We don't get it.
Jim, I saw you nodding a lot. Any reflection? Anything that you think would be? Oh.
So thank you very much for that, the enlightenment, and for sharing these practical strategies. I think that's really helpful for a lot of educators coming into very difficult conversations. So I appreciate that. If I just did have a question about when you were talking about the development of intercultural sensitivity, and I wanted to ask, before you get to acceptance, and what you said in that development was really interesting, because you said that acceptance tends to be more of a passive. It's passive rather than active.
Active, yeah.
In some of the professional development that I do, working with LGBTQ plus youth and that awareness in K-12 schools, oftentimes there is this idea of like, all right, well, we need to tolerate each other. And I'm like, no, it's not about tolerance.
Right.
It's more about acceptance.
Right.
So where would you see this idea of tolerance in there? Would you see that as more of a denial?
Yeah, tolerance I would put more in those earlier stages. I'm trying to think about where. Yeah, maybe denial. Yeah, I would say probably denial. I think there's connection to tolerance with minimization too. Not defense, because again, I think defense is a stage where you're not really tolerating. You know, maybe you think you are, but you're generally not. And so I think we all know tolerance is. I always thought it was weird. I was like, why are we talking about like tolerating each other? I'm like, is that like? So I'm glad that we've moved beyond that.
Yeah, because tolerance almost dismisses the significance of what you should be focusing on.
It's the absolute bare minimum.
Yeah, it's in a way it's almost an erasure.
Yeah.
But we don't feel that way because tolerance feels like it's a gift. We're willing to listen without listening, without really taking it in.
Yeah.
So,
The only thing I'm doing when I'm tolerating is I'm agreeing not to be hostile.
Yeah. That's what it feels like sometimes.
Anything else? I got literally 2 minutes, and then I gotta drive to the airport. Or 1 minute.
I just wanted to say thank you. Again, it's just affirming. I think that where I work, we really teach in silos. Even within our department, it's really 3 main full-timer individuals. I can't really say that's necessarily a department. And we've been trying to move in that direction, but the reality is many of us work very much individualistic.
Yeah.
And so I appreciate everything that you shared because it was very affirming. Because again, I'm always kind of fighting myself. Like, am I off? Maybe I, start questioning my own gifts. And so again, thank you. And I love that you address, in many ways, you're addressing the intellect, but you're also engaging the heart. And I think true educators that are not transactional but transformative address the intellect and the heart, and if I do dare say, spirit.
Yes.
And so there's a holistic experience going on, and then there's intent, of like, if I want to, what do I want to bring in the classroom? Like, do I want to bring in joy, right? So how do I evoke their natural joy in the classroom? If I'm also saying, wait a minute, it's been tough. It's in the middle of the semester, so I'm reading. I try to read the world. So therefore I try to read the room. And sometimes students, they just don't have it.
Yeah.
And I'll ask them, like, how are you feeling? What do you, what's going on? And they're like, I'm really tired, or I'm I'm really struggling. Let's get out of the classroom. Let's go outside.
Yeah. But
Why
that's
don't we
part
go
of where that
outside?
self-work matters so that you can show up joyfully. Because it's hard to manufacture that, right? You have to be able to do that work in your life to position yourself to do that.
Absolutely.
I'm really sorry. I absolutely have to go. I cannot miss this flight. It's going to be a real challenge for me if I do.
What you realize is you can, and that would be a real problem. Yeah. Thank you very much, Amer. There are box lunches out here if you want to grab. We have a small diversity of options that should give each of you a shot at what you want. And